Anyone remember? Okay, so I don't know if it's because we don't remember, or if we weren't, or everyone here was not here last week. But okay, so we looked at the I-you relationship as well as the I-it relationship. And we said that the I-you relationship, I'm going to put it in the chat so you're able to remember. We say that the I-you relationship is essentially a relationship between two people, two individuals who viewed each other as equals, and so there's a smaller social distance between them. They have a closer relationship because they see each other as valuable, they see each other as people, right? Is that becoming a little bit more familiar to us now? So now that we've looked at I-you, what do you remember about the I-it relationship and the role that it plays in interpersonal communication? You're welcome to put it in the chat or raise your hand if you want to unmute your mic. I'd very much love to hear some other voices tonight. Megan, do you want to give it a try? Oh, it's very quiet today. Okay, I see Megan is typing something for us. Okay, no, it's fine if you weren't in the chat then this is something that you guys must please go in and revise in your notes. I just want to point out that these sessions, because they're not tutorials and we're not necessarily supposed to be covering content. I am touching on the content because I think it is important to bring it up, if especially because communication or interpersonal communication and all these things that we're talking about, we can't really discuss the skill in isolation. The skill and the content are sort of embedded within one another. And this is why you see me touching on some of the content that is in your study guides. But these sessions alone are not going to be enough. So you do need to be familiar with the content in your study guides, in your textbooks. You need to be able to have read them and go through them so that when you do come to these sessions, it's not new stuff, right? We're recapping and we're getting to a point where we can apply it, because I do know that sometimes we don't have time to apply some of the things that we're reading, and therein really lies our success, right? Our ability to apply the things that we are consuming, or the content that we're consuming. So I don't want to be sort of a Debbie Downer here, but it really doesn't help us if we come to these sessions every week and we're not engaging, or we don't remember, or we haven't sort of read through our material, or we don't even remember, I think, what was discussed last week, because these things, it does build on one another. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that that these sessions would not be enough. So I do hope that outside of this, that we are engaging with our content, we are engaging with study guides and textbooks. Okay. All right, so Megan said that most relationships start at I-IT level and move to IU, and IU accounts for most of our interactions. All right, thanks, Megan. Thanks for attempting there. And yeah, exactly. Most relationships will start in at I-IT. So essentially an I-IT relationship, if you just think of the nouns there, representing an individual, and then it representing usually an object. So that already shows us that in this relationship, one person is viewed as an individual, the person themselves, they view themselves as an individual, and they view the other person as an object. So not necessarily an object as in you would look at someone and not consider their feelings or not think about them as human. You would still think about them as human, but the I-IT relationship, it's more like you think of them as a means to an end. So the examples that we gave around this kind of relationship is a boss and employer type of an employee type of relationship. So yes, your boss knows, of course, that you're human and you have feelings, but that's not necessarily their first priority when they think about you, right? The first thing is usually like, okay, how much, I don't want to say it in a very crude way, but they think of you in terms of, okay, what has this person done for the company today? Because this company is mine and I'm going to make money, right? So it's more about the use of the person to you, to them, even vice versa. As you, as an employee, will look at your boss, not necessarily as, you know, maybe John, if that's your boss's name, you're just like, oh, John, he's such a nice person. Yes, you'll think about that, but the primary thing that you think about is like, okay, John is my boss and he pays my salaries, and my salary is what allows me to live a certain type of life or to provide for my family. So even in that way, you are seeing John more as an it as opposed to a you. So an IU relationship would be, of course, very different. And you would notice that there's quite a distance between yourself and your boss. You're not as close. You wouldn't communicate in the same way. You don't relate to one another in the same way in an I-IT relationship that you would relate to maybe your husband or your boyfriend or your best friend or your sister, which is more our IU relationships, right, which are closer to us, which we see each other as equals, we see each other as full humans, and it's not about what I can get from this person or what this person can do for me, but more about who this person is, right? So I hope that that's quite clear. And from the definitions or the descriptions of those two relationships, I think we can already begin to sort of think about what communication looks like in those two contexts. And so, especially for the 1502 students, context is a big thing in your module particularly, right? So we're looking at communication in context. So think about what it looks like when you're communicating with a cashier at the shop versus what it looks like when you're communicating to your husband or your wife, right? Think about what it looks like when you're talking to your manager, whether it's even via WhatsApp, right? Because I know that now we use WhatsApp even for work now. So are you using WhatsApp in the same way? Are you texting your manager in the same way on WhatsApp than you are texting your best friend? I don't think so, right? So context plays such a huge role in our communication. I think this is what I want us to pull from this particular section. All right, so we looked at the two types of relationships, and then finally we sort of closed off and we looked at this concept of interpersonal communication and self-disclosure. And we essentially said self-disclosure is about how much of yourself you are willing to disclose to other people. How much of yourself are you willing to reveal to someone else? And what are the factors that influence or that play a role in how much you disclose, right? Of course, I'm already starting to think about, well, it really depends on who it is, right? But we are always disclosing in every interaction, we are revealing parts of ourselves. So it just depends on now what kind of relationship you have with the person will depend. The kind of relationship you have will influence the level of disclosure. It will influence how often and how much you're going to reveal of yourself to this particular person. So even in these workshops, I find, because I'm communicating with you guys, I do find myself disclosing parts about myself to you. So it maybe in some of the examples that I give, you'd be able to say, oh, so she's from this kind of background, or so, she has a husband or she doesn't have a husband, etc. Right? So through the examples, through just the interactions, you will be able, I am disclosing myself. And we also highlighted that disclosure isn't always a conscious process. So you don't always know that you're revealing yourself to someone. And so it's interesting because it's one of those sort of unintentional communicative acts. And it comes in different ways. So this is sort of where we stopped off last week. I hope that everyone's quite clear and quite happy with that. And this notion of unintentional and intentional communication is something, as part of what we're actually going to look at today. It's one of the components that we're going to look at today. So for the 1501 students, you can follow along in your study guide. We are looking at Unit 3, and it is the communication process. So like I said, I tried as much as possible. I'm trying as much as possible to not go too much into content, because that is not my mandate. But I do understand that for us to grasp the skill and to get the skill, we do need some sort of framing and some context, and that is what the content provides us. Okay. For those who are not 1501 students, I don't think they would be people who are not 1501, because that is, I believe, a core module. But you should easily also be able to follow along, because it also does relate to some of the things that are discussed in 1502, especially around the notion of context and what communication looks like in different spaces. Okay, are we all good? Are we all here? Awesome. I see a thumbs up. I see another thumbs up. Thanks so much. It's good for me to know that we're all here still. Okay, so I think before we jump into the communication process, there was a section that we didn't manage to cover last week, and that is around communication research. And so I think I just wanted to quickly touch on that before we get into the communication process, because it gives us an idea of also why we study communication science. Like, what is the importance of actually working through all of these things that oftentimes we hear it and it seems like, well, this is very obvious stuff, right? I don't think there's anything particularly groundbreaking in the content that we're hearing from these sessions, right? It's things that we kind of know, we kind of have a sense of, but I think it's good to position us within, to understand that we are positioned within the context of an academic institution. And as a result, we need to be able to really relate everything back to the academic context and to understand where this fits in. So where does communication science fit in your general studies, right? For most of you, this module or these modules form part of maybe your psychology degree or your social work degree. So why do you think that this is the case? Can we get some thoughts, why do you think you're having to study communication science as part of a psychology degree or a social work degree? or an education degree? You're welcome to just put things in the chat. I'll give us a minute to think about it and then put it in the chat. No problem, Megan. I was asking, why do you think that we are studying something like communication science in the context of whatever degree you're doing? So I know that for some of us, this module forms part of our social work degree or our psychology degree or education degree. So why do you think that is the case? Why do you think we have to do something like communication science as part of our studies? Okay, I see some interesting comments coming in the chat. So Anthea says that all those degrees or jobs will require you to communicate, and it's just better if you know how to effectively communicate. Exactly. Carla says because you need to be able to know how to communicate with other people effectively. Takira says because the career field requires me to interact with and communicate information to people. And Megan says communication is the core of every job we take on. There's always a need for communication, be it verbal or written. We study communication to be able to channel our information correctly. Wonderful. So all of these responses I 100% agree with. Communication really does form the basis of most, if not all, of our professions, right? So imagine being a teacher who's not able to communicate effectively. How are you going to bring your messages across to your students? Imagine being a counselor or a social worker who's not able to read, verbal and nonverbal cues. How would you be able to communicate? How would you be able to not just communicate effectively, but do your job effectively, right? Because your job is really formed on the basis of being able to speak to clients and speak to people and really get a sense of where they are at, and to identify their needs and the need that they have, or what you need to do to help them, right? So it's not just the verbal communication, also the written communication. You need to write reports. You need to make recommendations as teachers. You need to, grade assignments and all those things. So communication, I think, not just forms the basis of our professions, but our lives, right? It is so integrated in every aspect of our lives. It's almost impossible for us to go through life without communicating. I mean, it's the one thing, or language is the one thing that really makes us different from other species, right? That makes humans different. So yes, it is important, and therefore, even in the context of our education, it of course is very important. And so we look at communication research here, because research, as you will move on into your studies, you'll find that research also plays a huge role in the social sciences, right? So yeah, so I see Jamie Lee's also commented and said communication attempts to enforce understanding of messages. All study fields require an understanding of it, 100%. So yeah, so research, again, is one of those things where we're trying to identify a need in, yes, a need in the community. And so as a researcher or as a student of social science, you will most likely identify a problem in a community and want to solve it. And communication forms a big part of being able to conduct that research, because you need to be able to speak to participants. You need to know how to speak to certain types of people, right? Like I said, context is key. You won't speak to teenage or high school children if you're doing some research on teenage pregnancy. I think I use that example a lot. But if you're doing a study on teenage pregnancy, you're not going to speak to those young girls in the same way that you would go and speak to maybe yeah, fathers, right? If you're doing a study on absent fathers, or relationships of fathers with their children, right? You'll speak to them very differently. And so we need to have the skills and the tools to know how to navigate all those types of situations. So yeah, I'll just move on then. It brings us to the concept of research. And as I said, research is there to fulfill a particular need. It is there to answer a particular question in the society, and it requires certain communication skills. So I'll look at just two types of research. And I'm not sure if I'm sure, but I don't assume, but I think that you would have heard these two terms already. So we have qualitative research as well as quantitative research. So qualitative research really is when you're trying to understand something in depth. You're trying to understand the reason for something. So for example, you're trying to understand why parents allowed their children to watch any TV program, right? Or you're trying to understand the effect of teenage pregnancy on the community. So you're trying to understand that why. And so you will find that with qualitative research, most of the methods and the tools are going to be very different from quantitative research. And if you already start thinking about that word quantitative, quant really talks to numbers, right? Numbers. And so quantitative research is there to provide quantitative data or statistics about a certain thing. So you can have the same research area and have two different studies. You can have a qualitative study on teenage pregnancy, and what that will look like is you going to teenagers, who, pregnant teenagers, and speaking to them and asking them like how, maybe not how, yes, we know how, but asking them sort of like, how has this impacted their lives? What are their plans? How do they feel about being, a pregnant teenager, etc., etc. So all of those more deep and personal sort of qualitative kind of data. But then if you're doing a quantitative study or research on the same topic, you're not necessarily interested in the hows and the whys. You more want to get a sense of the statistics, or how prevalent it is, right? So you're not going to go speak to every individual teenager, pregnant teenager. You will rather want to get a list and say, okay, in this school there are maybe 200 girls, and then 30 fell pregnant in grade 9, 17 fell pregnant in grade 10. And so you're focused on the numbers and what the numbers are trying to tell us. Is there a trend? Is it that the higher in the grades the students are, the more they're getting pregnant, or the less they're getting pregnant, right? But for you, it's more about the numbers. Whereas with qualitative, it's more about the experiences, right? The experiences of the participants, the opinions, what they have to say. So it's that qualitative data. Okay, so we can use the same research, but that's focusing on two different things. And you can still get very interesting insights from both of those studies. Okay, I hope that is clear. That's just a very brief introduction to qualitative versus quantitative research. Is there a question? Okay, well explained. Thank you. Okay, so now we've looked at sort of the types of research. Now I want us to focus on sort of the types of observation research. And observation research really is, as it sort of, the name sort of implies, that it is you're collecting data by sort of observing something or watching something. So it's either you're going to be watching people's behavior, it's either you're going to be analyzing some documents or content, but it's really just this process of you as a researcher being on the outside and watching what's happening, right? Watching a TV show. You can actually, I find it quite interesting, but people actually do research on TV shows. Like they would just watch a show and analyze maybe the societal implications of a particular show. So that's quite interesting. So yeah, something like that would be observation research. So within observation research, we have ethnographic research and excuse me. So these things are this session is just going to give very broad general overview of these concepts. As you go up into your second and third years, you will of course go into a lot more detail, but I think this is just to give us a sense of where communication will fall in terms of your research, and then the importance of it in this activity. Okay, so ethnographic research is where the researcher essentially goes and lives with the people that they are researching. So if you are looking into pregnant teenagers, you'll actually go and you will live there. So what kind of data do you think someone would collect in such a research space in terms of qualitative or quantitative? If I'm going and I'm actually living there, say for a month, and I'm living with these pregnant teenagers, or these these orphans in a particular orphanage, what kind of data would I be collecting in that space? Excellent qualitative data, right? Because you're looking at the experiences of these, you know, you're really in there, you're in their lives, you get to see how they experience things, how do they react to certain things. So yeah, that would definitely be qualitative data. And so I think as we're talking through this, just think about the way that you would, as a researcher, would interact or communicate with these participants, right? The kind of approach that you're going to take is going to be very important, because this is a sensitive group, right? It is a sensitive topic, and you are coming in as a stranger. So just think about what the dynamics of that kind of relationship would be. Just think about it in the back of your minds. Okay, and then we have field research, and field research really is just where you as the interviewer, you're going out and you as a researcher are going out and you're interviewing people, you're having discussions with people, whether it's one-on-one discussions or focus group discussions, right? Again, we can already see that this would sort of be qualitative data, right? Because you're actually talking to people, you're getting their insights. And then we have participatory research, and this is where it's similar to ethnographic research, where you're watching, where you actually are embedded in the community of whoever you're studying. So if you are studying the San, right, the Khoisan group in Cape Town, you'll actually go and you live with them for some time. That's ethnographic, right? But with participatory research, what's different is that you're not just going in to observe them as an outsider. You're actually going in, you're observing them, but you're also participating in what they are doing, right? So if they say, okay, every Wednesday night as part of our culture, we do this or we do that, or we tell stories, you actually become part of them, and so you actually have to participate. You also join them in telling stories. Or if they say, you know, every Saturday mornings we go here and we go and sell, we gather some stuff and we go sell it, you would also go and do that. So I find that this to be very interesting. Of course, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot, and we can see from the relationship types that we discussed that in this context, it's easy for the relationship to go from I-it, where it was I'm a researcher and these are my participants, and my interactions with them is just to get data from them. And then it can easily change to an IU, right? Because you're with them every day, you're sleeping with them, you like wake up with them, you do the same activities that they do. So yeah, this is quite an interesting form of research. And then we'll move on to questioning research, which I guess we can already tell that it is about questioning as opposed to observing. The first one was observing, so this is questioning. And then face-to-face is when you sort of sit down and you're asking questions. You're interviewing a person, or you give them a list of questions and they have to write it down, right? So it's questions and you're getting responses from that. Excuse me. And then focus groups, similar, we touched on that on top. So focus groups can form part of both, right? They can be in observation, or they can also be in questioning. And then the last one is by means of a questionnaire. So you would send out a questionnaire. I think we've all received a questionnaire or filled in a questionnaire at some point in our lives. Get a questionnaire, and it's important then, especially with something like a questionnaire, where the researcher isn't there to explain a question to you. So it then becomes important for them to make sure that the questions are very clear, that the writing is very simple. Otherwise, if someone can't understand it, then they haven't really communicated that questionnaire effectively, and that will actually impact the kind of information that they're going to get back. Because if someone doesn't understand what you're asking, they're not going to give you the answer that you're looking for. Okay, so all of this, like all that we've discussed right now, really have specific requirements in terms of for the researcher, but also in terms of the communicative requirements, like how they should communicate, what mediums they should use, what is the best kind of relationship to establish and to develop with the participants. Of course, we look at also context will play a role. So if I am going into, for example, Zulu community, I need to be mindful of the culture and the traditions that form part of it. I can't, as a woman, just decide to go, okay, I'm going to go talk to the chief today and just rock up in my jeans and whatsoever and go talk to the chief. You know, I need to follow the customs and the culture and whatever sort of, what's the word? Oh, whatever procedure, sorry. Whatever procedure is required for, you know, someone to go and speak to the Zulu king. So yeah, context will always play a role. Context, participants, time, environment, all of those things really, really will always play a role in the way that we're communicating with others. Okay, I hope everyone's good with that. We're just going to then move on to the communication process, and you'll see some of like what we've talked about in. Again, like I said, these things aren't, or the things that we're looking at aren't particularly new or groundbreaking stuff. It's things or that we are familiar with, that we have experienced. I believe most of us are at least 20 years of age, and in our 20 years of life, 20 plus years of life, we have, you know, come across these things either in theory or in practice, but we have definitely been a part of this process. Okay, so yeah, so now we just look at the communication process, and we know from sort of our first session that communication can be best summarized as the process of transmitting a message from a sender to a receiver in an understandable manner. So I just want to highlight that the last two words, understandable manner. If I now speak a different language, maybe if I speak French, I am sending a message to you, right? So I've done my part as a sender and I've sent the message. You have received the message. But if you've not understood the message, we cannot say that communication has taken place, right? So I think I just want to highlight that. It must be understandable. It must be, the receiver must be able to decode and make meaning of what the sender has sent. Otherwise, it's sort of an incomplete process. All right. So we have seen now that communication really forms a part of all aspects of our lives, right? And it is quite interdisciplinary. So it's not that communication is only going to be, you're only going to come across it in a communications module, right? You've seen it come up in your psychology, in your social work, even in something like science and maths. It also does play a role there. So it's not just in one space. So, and that's why we often don't have a solid definition, as in a definition that sort of everyone will sort of narrate word for word. But I think the key one is just to say, hey, it needs to form, it is a process that needs to include a sender and a receiver, a message being sent and received and understood, right, in the context of like some other stuff. But I think the key things is that. So of course, if people can't really decide or don't have like a core definition for communication, it means the theorists also don't have. And we know the theorists in academia, they like to have different definitions for the same thing. But I think what's important to note is that every theorist who has a different definition or a different view of communication is looking at it from their perspective, right? From the perspective that's important to them. And we talked about this in our session around interpersonal communication, where we said your life experiences is going to affect your view of things, right? It's going to affect the way that you look at something like teenage pregnancy, right? Two people will look at that completely different. You know, someone who was raised in a very traditional, very conservative home will say, no, that's bad. You know, and someone who was raised in a more liberal home would say, you know, these things happen, it's fine. You know, so the first person from the conservative home will probably think to themselves, oh my gosh, like this girl, her life is over, or she's like really ruined her life now. You know, she won't be able to go to school. So their upbringing and their experiences has shaped the way that they're looking at things. Whereas the more liberal one would say, well, you know, it does happen. It's unfortunate, but of course she can still go to school. There's society has evolved to a point where getting pregnant as a teenager is not the end of your life, right? So I say that just to bring back to the fore the fact that every theorist is coming with a different view of communication. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. It doesn't mean that there's one that's right or one that's wrong. It just means that they are looking at it from different perspectives. And it's important for us then to be able to understand these different perspectives, so that when we are sort of communicating and we are sort of interacting with, whether it be our clients, whether it be students, that we sort of know which theory we are drawing from. Okay, so real quickly, we've got the technical view of communication, and this view really is concerned about how accurately and efficiently messages are passed on from one person to another across a channel, like, you know, the telephone or airwaves or the radio. So for them, it's more about, has this message been sent properly? So if I speak now, can you hear the words properly? It's more about the technical part of it. Can you hear the words properly? If something's on the radio, are the sounds coming out properly? Are the images coming out properly? Can I see it, right? So for them, it's more about, is it being sent efficiently? Not necessarily about how it's being received, right? It's more about, is the medium that is being used effective, sending the message effectively? Okay. And then we've got meaning-centered view. If there are any questions, please do pop it in the chat. But yeah, so, and then the meaning-centered view of communication, these theorists are really looking at what are the things that will motivate us to communicate in the first place. What are the meanings that we are attaching to the messages that we're sending? How are we using communication to make meaningful, or to build meaningful interactions? And so the focus here isn't on, you know, is the thing sending correctly? The focus here is on the interaction between the participants, right? It's the meaning that we're making, where we're trying to get out of it. So if we just look at that process of sender to receiver message in an understandable manner, their focus is that understandable manner. You know, what's the meaning that we're bringing here? Okay. And then we have theorists who see communication as a process. And here they will sort of look at the entire process, for lack of a better word. They'll look at the whole entire process, and they'll tell us that, you know what, communication is not a fixed thing. It's not a case of one person sending something to another person and then the other person just accepts it and that's it. They're saying it's a very dynamic process. So as the one person sends to the other person receives it, then the other person also sends back. And so it's basically this circular process that keeps going and keeps going. It doesn't end just because I've received it, right? So right now, I'm communicating to you guys. The theorists who see communication as a process will say, well, communication doesn't end the minute the words leave my mouth, right? It continues to when you guys actually hear it, you decode it, as in you understand it, and you engage with it, as in you know what I'm saying and you're trying to make sense of it. And if you were to ask me a question, or if you were to make a comment, or if something comes to mind as I'm speaking, that is then you also participating in this process, right? This irreversible process. Okay, I hope that's okay with you all. And then we have those who see communication as a transaction. And so the transaction, they regard communication, it's not just an interactive process of exchanging meaningful messages, but more as a transaction between the participants during a relationship. So the transaction being there's the focus being on the exchange of messages, right? So I say something, you say something, I say something. So it's this transaction, right? There's a constant transaction of sending and receiving messages. So it's not that I will always be the sender. I'll be the sender for the first turn, and then you're the receiver, and then you become the sender, and then I become the sender. Sorry, what am I saying? You become the sender, and then I become the receiver. So for example, when you post something in the chat, you then become the sender of a message, and I'm the receiver because I'm the one, or the rest of the class are the receivers of that message. So the transactional theorists say that the messages that are then sent have two dimensions. So it's content and relationship. The content is what is actually being said, right? So the words that are coming out of my mouth, or the words that you guys are typing in the chat, while the relationship is about how the content will change the relationship between us, right? So the more I the more I speak and I sort of self-disclose as we're going along, it sort of changes somehow. I don't fully agree with this, but it does change the way that then you maybe will perceive me, or it adds to your perception of me as a facilitator. Whether that be a good or bad thing, I'm not quite sure. Okay, so I hope that's okay. If that one sounds a bit tricky, please let me know. But okay, I think at this point, I want us to just reflect really briefly on these approaches. And as I said, there isn't a right or wrong answer to them, but I do want us to maybe just start playing around with the idea and start thinking about it based on the discussion or based on the descriptions of it. What would you say are the strengths and limitations of each of these approaches? So I'm going to quickly post in the chat a link to a document. So you can just quickly download the document, and you'll see that it is a table that asks you to sort of tabulate the strengths, limitations, and implications of each communicative approach. So please let me know if you've been able to download that. Awesome, I see a thumbs up. Great. Download that, fill in as much as you can. I think I'll give us about 5 minutes, 6 minutes, and then we can come back and I just want to hear what your thoughts are around that. Okay, so we'll just quickly break for 5 minutes. I'll let you look at that, and then we can discuss. Hi everyone, how's the activity going? Should we do 2 more minutes or are you more or less done? Okay, we'll do 2 more minutes. Okay, I think we should all be done by now. If you're not, okay. It's strange that you're not able to open the link. I think everyone else was able to. So I'm not sure what's happening there. But it's okay. I think maybe you can. Yeah, I'll try to, because I'm not able to send the actual document to you. So maybe try being logged into your Gmail, because it is a Google Doc, and you should be able to open it. Okay. So what are our initial thoughts? What did we say was a strength of the technical view of communication? Allows to establish effective solutions to problems, greater accuracy in communication. Okay, what do you mean by it allows us to establish effective solutions to problems? Oh, sorry, I read that wrong. Yes, I understand. Got you. Thanks, Jamie. Anyone else? Meaning-centered view. What would you say the strengths are of the meaning-centered view of communication? What did you guys write? Surely you. Or what are the limitations of it? Maybe I'm assuming that they are strengths. Maybe there are no strengths. Maybe they're just limitations. Okay, so maybe there are no strengths or limitations of that. Okay, so I'm going to move on for the sake of time. And yeah, I'm hoping that you have completed the activity, and it really just helps us to be able to critically analyze the information that we are given. Again, it really forms part of this general and broader skills that we're trying to establish, and that when you do come across theories, and you will come across many theories in your studies, that you're able to look at them critically and say, what are the strengths of these theories? What are the weaknesses? What are the implications? And from there, you're able to truly engage with the material that you're given. Okay, but because of time, I am going to move on. Okay, so following that, we want to look at the dimensions of communication. Excuse me. And really, the dimension of communication just gives us this view that communication happens in different ways. And we have already sort of touched on this in briefly in different sessions already. So we're going to look at things like verbal versus nonverbal communication, oral versus written communication, formal versus informal, and intentional versus unintentional communication. So just to get a brief introduction, or sort of a brief overview of verbal versus nonverbal communication, we are going to watch a quick video around this. Okay, so just let me know if you see the screen there. Can you see the screen? It should say it's verbal and nonverbal communication. It's a video. Okay, great.
Communication is the process of interchanging information, ideas, feelings, and opinions with or without the use of words. The process of communication looks like this. A sender encodes a message through a channel to a receiver who decodes the message, and after interpreting it, gives appropriate feedback through the channel to the sender. So in this way, the process of communication continues. On the basis of channel, there are two types of communication: verbal and nonverbal communication. Verbal communication is communication with the use of words and language to communicate the intended message to the other party. It can be performed in two ways: oral communication and written communication. On the other hand, nonverbal communication is the process of communicating without the use of words, and takes place through signals such as facial expressions, body language, gestures, postures, physical appearance, etc. In a face-to-face interaction with just one person, you can exchange up to 10,000 nonverbal cues in less than 1 minute. Nonverbal communication is the way people reinforce or replace spoken communication through the use of body language or voice. Imagine your friend storms into her office after lunch. She's red-faced, tight-lipped, and speaks to no one. She throws her backpack on the desk, slumps down on her office chair, and glares out the window. You ask, "Are you all right?" She snaps back in an angry tone, "I'm fine." Which message do you believe? Her nonverbal communication, behavior and voice tone, or her verbal one, words alone? Most likely you believe the nonverbal message. So what is a nonverbal cue exactly? Nonverbal cues include all the ways you express yourself, apart from the actual words you speak. And because these nonverbal cues are sent primarily from the emotional brain, rather than the neocortex, they create more honest and revealing messages. They are body movements, body orientation, nuances of the voice, facial expressions, details of dress, and choice and movement of objects that communicate. While the research seems to differ in terms of actual percentages and the context that influences this, the most widely accepted information on the topic of how much our communication is nonverbal seems to be this. 7% refers to the words used, 55% involves body movements, facial expressions, and other nonverbal cues, and 38% is what we refer to as paralanguage. This is your tone of voice, volume, pitch, etc. The art of effective listening to nonverbal messages is to recognize behaviors that may have potential message value, and then to search for other behaviors that suggest a pattern. The key is to ensure congruence between thoughts or feelings and nonverbal messages. Also, that nonverbal messages are congruent with verbal messages. According to Mariska and Harwood, 2013, nonverbal awareness training focuses on common nonverbal messages and how they are conveyed. The 5 areas that illustrate nonverbal communication which can be explored include kinesics, for example, facial expressions and gestures, paralanguage, vocal tone and pacing, proxemics, for example, personal space and barriers, autonomic output, for example, blushing, sweating, and display, clothing, office decor, etc. Here are some kinesics examples of nonverbal behavior. A tense and nervous manner would show a stooped posture, no eye contact, crossed arms, and clenched fists. Whereas if you were listening, you might be looking at the person, smiling or nodding, have an open posture with your palms open, and be in a relaxed position. On the other hand, a key area related to paralanguage is silence. Just as words and gestures communicate important meanings, silence also can serve valuable purposes in the communication process. Take a moment to think about how you see and feel about silence. From a Western cultural context, silence can sometimes be awkward, possibly an indication that no one knows what to say, or the conversation has run dry. However, the unspoken meaning behind silence is quite different in other cultures. In Arab culture, silence is a way of showing respect. It's important to be aware of potential challenges that might arise with nonverbal communication in the context of different cultures. Awareness and tolerance aid good nonverbal communication. Here's an exercise. This exercise is designed to increase awareness of expressed feelings in a nonverbal way. List the possible feelings that may be behind the nonverbal expression. The radio is playing in the background while 2 flatmates are studying. One of them gives a big sigh, gathers her books, and goes to her room. What might she be feeling?
Okay, so I hope we were all able to follow that. So yeah, from the last little scenario that was provided, what are your thoughts on what the other student was feeling? Frustrated. Yeah, because she's obviously trying to study and they've got this loud music playing in the background. So she didn't say anything, right? She didn't actually verbally communicate her frustration, but through this nonverbal language, by walking away and sighing, she clearly communicated something to her friend, right? Excuse me. Okay, so I think that's quite clear to us. And again, we have all come across verbal and nonverbal communication, and I do believe that we understand the differences. I think the thing that I would just want to highlight here is to really look out, especially for those of us who are, excuse me, those of us who are in or will be in service fields, right? So you're working with a client, if you're a psychologist or social worker, or even a student working with a student, the person may say one thing, but their nonverbal language is saying something else. And so it's important to sort of look out and see if the messages are congruent. If they're saying yes, but they're shaking their head, that's something to look out for. Right, so that's just something to note, that sometimes the verbal and the non-verbal communication can contradict one another, and in those cases it is important to sort of look a little bit deeper and not just take things at face value, as in not just take what they're saying into account, but also consider what they're not saying and how they are saying it. Okay, from there we move on to oral versus written. Of course, oral being the messages that are transmitted verbally or aloud. So either speaking, just speaking, that would be oral. And then, of course, this, for example, is an oral communication where I'm vocalizing and speaking out about the topic. And then, of course, written communication involves words, but sort of in a non-verbal dimension. So the things that you see on the screen now, that is a form of me communicating with you in the written form. So it's just words, and there's no sort of sound to it. Okay, so the non-verbal dimension here would be sort of, you see the font size and color. So from the layout of, oh, I'm so sorry, you can't see my screen. Someone should have told me I wasn't sharing my screen. Okay, so from the layout of what you're seeing on the screen right now, you would see that there is a heading. And how do we sort of understand that dimensions of communication is a heading? Because it is bolded, right? It is a different color, it's much bigger, it appears first on the page. So from those, without me having to say, our heading is dimensions of communication, you can already see that that's our heading for this topic, right? And then you'd see that the rest of the text is in black, so it's a different color. It is smaller font. Yeah, right. What's another thing that we're seeing on the screen that is communicating something else, something to us? Okay, we see a list that tells us that it's different topics, right, or subtopics of the heading that we discussed. Lovely. Anything else? There's a link for you to go watch. So, okay, so there's a link. There's no instruction to the link, but that link, and how do we know it's a link, is because firstly it's in blue, and usually when we insert links into a document, they turn blue, right? Or you press enter and then it just turns blue, and that blue shows us that that is something that is clickable usually. So without the word doc or the PowerPoint having to tell us this is a link, we already know then that this blue thing is a link, right? It's a link, but then we'll also see the format of it. We've come to understand through our interactions with the internet that if it starts with HTTPS, that it's usually a website, and that also gives us an indication that it is a link, right? You'd also see that the spacing, and I just want to note that as I was putting the slide together, I didn't realize all of these things. So it's very cool to be able to analyze this together. So you also note the spacing. So between the spacing between formal and informal and intentional and unintentional is the same as the spacing here, right? But you'll notice that verbal versus nonverbal, the spacing between this and the link isn't necessarily the same, right? So what could that also be telling us? Absolutely, that the link is linked or it's connected to this topic. Yes, lovely. The link is part of the nonverbal, the verbal versus nonverbal section. So we see the closeness of that compared to the closeness of the others shows us that, well, that means they're probably connected. They're probably related in some way. Okay, so I think this just points out to us, so sorry, that even with nonverbal or written writing, we shouldn't just look at the text, the content itself, right? But it forces us to actually look at the construction of the content. How has it been put together? Because even in that, something is being communicated to us, right? So the communication here with the written text is not always, it's not just going to be the actual content, but also how it is structured, what is the format of it, how has it been put together. That is also communicating to something to us, and that would almost be our non-verbal communication, right? So our verbal, or if I can say, yeah, so the words or content communication will be the actual words, and then the non-verbal, sort of the implicit communication here would be the spacing and the different colors and the different fonts. Okay, so that's just something to look into or to think about. And then we've got formal versus informal communication, and we know that this 100% depends on your context. So when you're involved in formal communication, you're paying attention to your verbal and your non-verbal languages. You're very, very careful about the words that you're using. You're very careful about your body language, especially if you are in an interview, for example. You're making sure that you're smiling, right? You keep your hands in front of you, and you make sure, like, you're sort of quite aware of everything that's around you in that formal space, right? So a formal communication can, of course, can be, of course, verbal or non-verbal, can be oral or written. But the key thing about that is that you're very aware of the context, or you're very aware of who you're writing to or who you're speaking to, and so you'll choose your words and your actions wisely. With an informal communication, of course, it's very different. It's more relaxed. You can communicate more naturally. You're not really thinking about your facial your facial expressions too much. So for example, when you're having a chat with your best friend, you're not too concerned about using the right English or using the right words. You'll most probably also mix, if you speak a second or third language, you'll throw in you'll code switch a bit, add some words there. You'll laugh very loud, maybe not very pretty, right? Because that is a very relaxed space, and you're able to just be yourself and to be free. So there's not as much self-policing in that space as you would in a formal, where you're sort of thinking about, oh, I shouldn't have said this word, I should have said that word, right? And then we've got intentional and unintentional communication, and the words are quite self-explanatory here. Intentional communication is when, of course, you how do I say this without saying you intend to communicate? But yes, intentional communication is really, really just that. You intended to communicate, so you sort of planned, not necessarily planned it, but you knew that you were going to do it, right? So if your friend graduated, you knew that, okay, you're going to congratulate her. So you had that intention to communicate with her in that format. And that means you're going to wish her congratulations verbally. Maybe you're going to hug her as well. Or just, use whatever sort of mediums to communicate that you're very proud of her. Unintentional communication, of course, is the opposite, is you sort of communicate without knowing that you are communicating something. And this is usually through nonverbal signs. So oftentimes if you're sitting in a classroom and you're listening to a boring lecture, maybe right now, if you're sitting and you're yawning, you're looking around, or you're checking your time, you're like, when is this lady going to finish? You would then be unintentionally communicating that, A, you're bored, or you're tired, or you're hungry, right? Without necessarily meaning to communicate that. So if this is a physical session, then I would then see that, the student is like lounging a bit, or the student is yawning a lot, and I would then be able to see that unintentional communication and take that and probably say, hey, let's take a break, let's get up and stretch, or whatsoever, right? Unfortunately, in this context, I can't see what you guys are doing, so I hope that if you are feeling tired, that you do stretch, that you do get up, you do drink some water. Yeah. Okay, so I think ultimately what we wanted to understand in this section is just the multidimensional nature of communication, right? And again, this sort of supports our initial statement about how it's difficult to have a very concise definition of communication. If you just think of the different varieties or the different elements that we've looked at, the different dimensions, the different forms of communication. So imagine we were to take all of this and try to box it up into one definition. It really wouldn't work. So it really is quite a complex process, communication, and it involves a lot of individual components, and it's going to look different in different contexts. So even the same communicative act, so congratulating a friend, will look very, very different between two people. So the way I'm going to congratulate my friend is not the same way you would congratulate your friend. Or maybe it would be the same, but your body language will be a bit different than mine. Or the tone of your voice when you say congratulations, friend, will be a little bit different to mine, right? So the same communicative act with the same intention can look very different for different people. Okay, hope we're still good with that. Okay, and then I think this is the last section that we're going to look at is the components of this process. So we've kept talking about this communicative process and how, all the different things you sort of need to consider. So I just want us to quickly run through, and I say run because I am aware of time. So we're quickly going to run through the different components of the communicative process. Okay, so essentially we would start with, I think maybe this diagram isn't the best, but we would start with the sender. So in the communicative process, of course, you need to start with people, the people who are going to do the communicating. So you would have a sender, who is the one that would essentially send the message, and then you would have a receiver on the opposite end. So sender over here in yellow, receiver over here in yellow. So they are on opposite ends because they are going to be doing different things, and they're also going to be exchanging this role. So yes, our sender is the one who starts off with a message. And the message is the thing, or I don't know if at this point we need to define what a message is, but it's basically the content of whatever he wants to say to the receiver. Okay, so then what happens here is the encoding. So I have a message, but now he needs to code that message or sort of understand or to put it out there. And then you will use the medium. The medium is basically the channel, or the channel that you would use. So this can be a physical channel. That is, I'll use my voice and a phone to send that message. So the medium is really, what are you using? What channel are you using to send this message? Right. And then the receiver then gets the message. But before, to determine that the receiver has fully received the message, he needs to have decoded it first. And decoding the message really is just breaking down what I've heard, because there's a difference between hearing and understanding, right? So breaking down what I hear, making sense of it, and then I have sort of successfully received it. The minute that I have made sense of that message, that I understand it, is when I've received it, right? And then, is when I've received it. And then the receiver, this is sort of the process then. The receiver would then, from what he understood, would then have his own message. So he will either want to reply. He will want to reply to the sender. But now he becomes the sender. I hope this is not too confusing. But then he becomes the sender, right? So he has now a message that he wants to say. He will encode it, as in put it in a way that makes sense, or construct the message in a way that makes sense. He will send it via the medium of his voice or a phone, for it to be decoded by the receiver, the sender, who now becomes the receiver, right? So this is that communication as a process theory that we looked at earlier. So that it's a process and it's ongoing. It doesn't particularly end here because, okay, I've received the message, that's it. It doesn't end, it continues, because we, especially in conversation, we continue speaking, we continue sending and receiving different messages. So in the context of all of this, around all of this, what's happening is there's something called noise. So noise is any stimulus that interferes with the transmission and reception of messages. So if we just think of traditional noise, if you hear noise, it's going to prevent you from hearing something else that you're really wanting to hear. So we've got this here because we're saying this is something that can interrupt this process. If there's a noise, and you can think about noise not just the physical noise, like if there's a loud sound here, of course the receiver is not going to hear the message, right? But also if the receiver is angry at the sender for some reason, that can also be noise, because there's an attitude or there's something that's blocking them from really hearing what the sender has to say. And so remember, we're not saying that they don't hear, or from really understanding. So if you think of the context of an argument, right? When you're really angry with someone and they're talking to you, you hear what they're saying, but you're not understanding, you're not decoding the message, because that anger forms as noise. So that is actually getting in the way of you being able to fully decode what they're saying and understand what they're saying. Right, so noise can be anything, whether internal or external, that prevents you from hearing. Also, if you, something like language, if there's a language barrier, that can be noise, because that's going to prevent you from hearing what the other person is saying. Or if they're saying something that, if they've encoded the message in a way that doesn't make sense, like I've had many conversations with people and I'm just like, I don't know what you're saying. That is also noise. That's a more internal semantic noise, because there's a problem with the meaning of what has been said. I'm not fully grasping it, right? So noise is anything that prevents, any stimulus that prevents that interferes with the transmission of the message from sender to receiver. Okay. We also have, of course, I did talk about decoding. That is the interpretation of that message, so how the receiver receives that message. He'll of course interpret it, and he'll interpret it based on his background and subjective experiences. So this is a very social, a very interpersonal process, because the way that I'm going to understand what you're saying is also going to be based on my experiences and my background, my framing, my morals, my belief system. So that will also affect the way that I interpret what you say. And that's why you'd have people who say, I'm trying to think of a really good example here. Something like abortion is bad, right? Two people may hear that same message and interpret it differently, right? Based on their subjective experiences, morals, values, and belief system. Okay, and that will of course affect how they receive it. So it's either they're going to say, wow, why would you say that? And they would, go on the attack, or they would, just take it in a different way. Okay, so I think I'm going to start wrapping up. And then we have feedback. Feedback is also happening. So noise is the thing that's interfering. And then feedback is the phase where they are sort of constantly sending, sorry, let me take that back. So you're constantly commenting on what the other person has said, and that's this process of feedback. And feedback is quite dynamic. It is an interactive process. It's not just, okay, I say A, and then you say B, and then I say C. And then usually how conversations go is I say A, you comment on A, and then you say B. So you will send me A, B. Then I will comment on B, what you've said, and I will add C. So I'm sending you BC. I hope that's not too, I would have liked to actually visually, graphically display this. But yeah, I hope that it makes sense and that there's no noise in interfering with this transmission. So yes, and that's just that process of feedback, that we're not always going to be sending each other new information. Sometimes you'll just be commenting on what the other person has said. Okay, and then finally, in the midst of all this, again, is our good friend context. We can't get away from context. We can't forget about context. So all of this could be happening, but it only fits in a particular context, right? So I will take the same message in a different way, depending on what's happening around me, depending on the context of that communication. So yes, we can't get away from our good friend context. So yeah, I don't think I need to talk any more about context, because I think at this point we really see it and we're able to apply it to different contexts. Two different contexts. Sorry, I found that funny. Okay, so I did want us to look into just a quick activity, but we don't have time for that, so I'm going to move on and maybe we can touch on it later. So on the topic of context, I have 3 more minutes. I'm going to rush through this. We have different contextual approaches, or just different places where communication finds itself. We are now not new to any of this. The first one being interpersonal communication. Of course, it's where communication takes place within ourselves, within yourself. So you thinking about your day, thinking about what you want to say to that friend when you meet them, or thinking about how nice you looked in that blue dress. That's intrapersonal communication, right? Communication taking place within ourselves. Interpersonal communication, we have looked at this, communication taking place between two people. It can be in a face-to-face in a face-to-face situation. All right, so now you've actually you started thinking about what you're going to say to your friend, then you meet your friend and you actually tell them what you wanted to say. So it's moved from intra to interpersonal. And then we've got small group communication. This is communication occurring in a group between 3 and 12 people. so example, you meet up with your group of friends and you start talking about what everyone has been doing for that month. Maybe you haven't seen each other in a month. So you come together in a small group, maximum of 12, and just communicate amongst one another. Okay, then we've got public speaking context. This is, of course, when the group becomes too large for direct interaction. So we talk about a public speaking context or oral presentation. So in public speaking, one person usually will address a group of people or an audience in a public setting. So a lecture, of course, a seminar, a church service, those are our examples of public speaking contexts. So it's usually only one person that is actively speaking and everyone else is usually listening. And then we've got mass communication. And mass communication, of course, is communicating to a large group of people who don't necessarily know each other and are not in the same place. So, for example, when you watch the news is transmitted to mass media because maybe everyone in the country is watching that news, what's it called, news bulletin. And so it's basically transmitting one message to a mass audience, usually over an electronic device like a radio, a TV. These days, of course, we have our cell phones. You send out a tweet, thousands of people can see it. You post an Instagram post, thousands of people can see it. And that is us also communicating on the mass communication level. All right, so that was just some things around our contextual approaches. And yes, I think we're actually done. Thanks, Carla. Right on time. So I don't know if there are any questions. I don't think so, but I also don't want to assume. So if there are any questions, please put it in the chat. I'm going to stick around for maybe 5 more minutes. And yes, let's have a lovely evening, ladies and gents. I don't know if we have the gent still here. I think he may have left. But yes, have a good evening. And please, if you have not completed the attendance register, go ahead and do so. And we will see each other next week. Thank you and bye.